Welcome to the 2024 Limited Permit Compliance Training. This training is mandated by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture to comply with federal regulations. Limited permits cannot be issued without this training. My name is Danielle DeVito, and I will be sharing this training video with you today. Here is a brief overview of the topics we are going to be covering today: the background, host trees, management, quarantine, interstate movement, documentation, and then review all of these topics. First, let's have some background information on spongy moth. Spongy moth was introduced to the United States in the late 1800s near Boston, Massachusetts. 150 years later, spongy moth has spread to the central U.S. Looking at this map, the dark blue represents where spongy moth is currently quarantined. The light green area represents the slow the spread zone, where moth populations are surveyed and monitored and actively managed. Lake and Cook counties are currently the only counties quarantined in Minnesota. Since 1980, spongy moth has defoliated over 1 million acres of forest each year. By 2011, this insect was causing an estimated of $900 million in annual damages in the U.S. This affects the timber industry, tourism, and the average homeowner in the area. This image depicts an aerial view of defoliation, which can result in devastated forest lands. Spongy moth feeds on over 300 species of trees and shrubs. Caterpillar feeding on leaves doesn't directly kill trees. The compounded stress makes them more susceptible to drought, disease, or insects, which can then cause tree mortality, as well as multiple years of heavy infestation. Next, let's discuss the spongy moth life cycle. There are 4 stages to the life cycle. Egg masses are the single life stage most likely to be encountered, as the spongy moth egg mass is present for most of the year. However, the caterpillar or the larva stage is the most damaging. Egg mass presence is the most significant life stage because it can be laid anywhere and sits for nearly a year. Female moths lay their eggs in large tan fuzzy clumps that are spongy-like to the touch. Each egg mass is around 1.5 inches long and contains 500 to 1,000 eggs. The egg masses often blend into the tree bark coloration. Spongy moth prefer to lay eggs in protected areas, such as deep bark cracks and splits, behind bark curls, in holes, and any other area that may be protected from view. Egg masses can also be laid on any surface. Over the course of the winter, the egg mass coloration lightens from the elements as well. Egg masses have that tan velvety appearance. The outer layer protects the eggs from the harsh winter weather. Again, there can be 500 to 1,000 caterpillars that can emerge from a single egg mass. Emergence from egg masses typically occur in early June in northern Minnesota, depending upon weather conditions. There is an approximately 4-week time delay from southern to northern Minnesota. Emerging caterpillar on the left are black and barely 1/4 inch in size. Spongy moth caterpillars will grow to be about 3 inches in length. In northern Minnesota, spongy moth are in the caterpillar life stage early June to late July. Spongy moth have a yellow head capsule followed by 5 pairs of blue dots and 6 pairs of red dots. These distinctive identifying signs don't appear until they're about 2 inches in size. A full-grown caterpillar can be as large as your index finger. Spongy moth has a very limited natural spread rate. Because female moths cannot fly, their only means of natural spread is by the caterpillars crawling to the tops of the trees and putting out a thin silk thread to move across the canopy. Wind gusts can transport them up to a mile away. Birds don't find them very attractive to eat, as their hairs can be long and irritating. Hatching time for the caterpillar is dependent upon temperature and weather, and this life stage lasts about 40 days. When trees are continually stressed from defoliation, they become susceptible to other pests such as our native borers and diseases. A healthy stand of trees can recover from defoliation, often sending out a second, smaller flush of leaves. This added stress won't kill them in 1 year if they are healthy. However, once stressed for multiple years, disease and other insects can impact the tree, causing mortality. Tree mortality rises after 2 consecutive years of being defoliated. Evergreens, however, will never recover from defoliation. Caterpillars can consume up to a square foot of leaves in a day. 70% of their feeding occurs in the later growth larva stage as they bulk up before the pupation stage. At this size, leaves can be stripped overnight. Once caterpillars have moved on from the feeding, they enter the pupa stage. This life stage is very short-lived, lasting about 2 weeks. You may never see this life stage. The pupa are brown to black, leathery looking, with orange hairs, often in areas similar to where egg masses are laid, crevices, cracks, and areas out of sight. Adult males emerge approximately 2 weeks after pupation occurs. The male moth pictured here on the left is approximately 1.5 inches in size. The female, white on the right, is notably larger at 2.5 inches in size. The male moth can typically fly up to 1.5 miles searching for a female. He locates her simply by the pheromone she releases. Other than the comma marks, the real identifier is the feathery antenna. Males are day flyers and are not attracted to light. Neither moth feeds as they have no mouth parts. Because females are much larger, her body weight prevents flight. If picked up, she will fall to the ground to her body mass. Her whole life is confined to an area she is laying egg masses. She also has the distinctive comma marks. Again, having no mouth parts, she will not feed during her lifetime and soon dies after laying eggs. Next, we will talk about some of the host trees and the main food source in northern Minnesota. The spongy moth caterpillar will consume 300 species of trees and shrubs. Some of its most favorite and common tree species that it feeds on are aspen, birch, and oak. Willow and basswood are also some of its other favorites. While pines are less preferred, they are at high risk because once caterpillars feed on them, our pine species will not regrow their needles once defoliated and therefore not recover. There are other insects that people often confuse spongy moth with. In this picture, you can see the slightly yellow head followed by the 5 pairs of blue dots and the 6 pairs of red dots. The other 8 images are other caterpillars you may encounter in Minnesota as well. For instance, the forest tent caterpillar, a native insect to Minnesota, is often confused and reported as spongy moth. However, spongy moth do not make white cocoons. Another confused insect would be the eastern tent caterpillar. They are often confused as well. Spongy moth do not make tents. And the fall webworm makes tents and feeds in the fall. However, spongy moth caterpillars do not make tents, and their caterpillar stage occurs earlier in the season than the fall webworms. Part of spongy moth survey and management is that the state and federal agencies collaborate in a national integrated pest management program called Slow the Spread to reduce the spread rate of spongy moth and limit its impacts. Slow the Spread is the world's largest and most successful integrated pest management programs. Spongy moth can easily be transported from areas of infestation to areas of non-infestation several miles ahead of the advancing front. Adult females will lay their eggs on virtually any type of outdoor household article: RVs, campers, wheel wells, tarps, buildings, logs, firewood, nursery stock. Just about any object is something a spongy moth can lay an egg mass on. Human activity has increased the natural spread from 1 mile a year to approximately 15 miles per year. The Slow the Spread project, Minnesota is partnering with USDA, APHIS, the U.S. Forest Service, and 11 other states located along that population front to slow the spread from eastern United States. When isolated populations are identified through annual survey programs, management projects are implemented to either eradicate or suppress the spongy moth. This partnership has reduced the spread by more than 60% and prevented infestation of more than 140 million acres in the past 15 years. Again, the goal is to slow the westward spread of the spongy moth. Regulations are in place in the quarantine to reduce the spread of to uninfested areas. Part of those regulations include training such as this. In transition zones, we actively work to manage the spongy moth with what we would call a mating disruption management. If isolated populations are identified in the uninfested zone, the goal is to eradicate using a product called BTK. BTK is a naturally occurring soil bacterium. When applied to forest canopy and consumed by caterpillars, it disrupts the caterpillar's digestion. BTK is something that is commonly used by organic vegetable farmers all the way up to the day of harvest. You may have seen these traps. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture sets about 20,000 traps annually on a grid pattern across the eastern portion of Minnesota. The inside of the trap is sticky and has a pheromone detected. Traps are set in the spring and will be removed in the fall. Lake and Cook County are the only counties currently under federal quarantine in Minnesota. This requires anyone hauling regulated items out of Lake and Cook County to have compliance with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Here we are looking at a map of the survey results from last year in 2023. Roughly 113,000 moths were caught in Minnesota last year. The brighter the color, the more moths caught per trap. You will notice that as the front of the moth invasion moves westward, survey activities are declining in Lake and Cook County. These images show the increase in moth catch from 2022 to 2023. This shows the westward front of the spongy moth across the region. The brighter the colors, the higher the moth catch was. These maps are made with the data collected from survey traps. The light yellow color are areas that were surveyed with no catch. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture is proposing to manage spongy moth detections in 7 counties between Fillmore and Houston, Chisago, Isanti and Pine, and Carlton and St. Louis County. We'll be targeting 42 specific areas, totaling approximately 170,000 acres, with the most areas to be managed in Carlton and St. Louis County. Spongy moth is a serious invasive forest pest that requires a quarantine to slow its spread. The federal quarantine limits the movement of regulated articles out of designated areas. A quarantine is a tool in managing and slowing movement across the U.S. and specifically Minnesota. Again, in Minnesota, Lake and Cook counties are currently the only 2 counties in Minnesota under quarantine for spongy moth. If you are interested in hauling from Wisconsin to Minnesota, you will need to obtain a USDA federal compliance agreement. Also, if you are unaware, Douglas County, Wisconsin was added to the quarantine in the spring of 2023. Regulated articles can be moved within the quarantined area. You cannot, however, move out of the quarantine area without proper certification or compliance. Quarantine violations occur when companies or individuals transport regulated articles out of the quarantined area without the appropriate documentation and can result in civil or criminal penalties. All life stages of spongy moth are regulated, as is pulpwood and nursery stock. Logs, firewood, and bulk bark products are all regulated as well. And any other means. Minnesota has an active public relations campaign for signage, brochures, and checklists, all located on the Minnesota Department of Ag webpage to educate travelers and homeowners about spreading this pest. Now let's discuss the movement in Minnesota. There are two documents in which to travel out of a quarantine. A limited permit has the least responsibility associated with it. The receiver accepts all responsibility. Saw bolts, pulpwood, or bark for fuel must be accompanied by a limited permit when leaving the Spongy Moth quarantined areas. Accurate statements are used when you have a compliance agreement, and the receiver also has a compliance agreement. Sometimes the word treatment can be confusing. The definition here pertains to an inspection. To repeat, a limited permit is a travel document for transporting pulpwood, sawbolts, and bark for fuel to a receiving facility. The responsibility under the limited permit falls to the receiving facility. They agree to processing requirements that minimize the risk of introductions at their site. Under their compliance agreement, they agree to treat any infestations at their site as a result of handling regulated materials. Under state and federal guidelines, you must attend trainings like this to obtain a permit. These items travel under a limited permit only if going directly to an approved receiving facility. This approval means that they maintain a current compliance agreement with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and accept 100% of the responsibility. It is important that you check with the facility in which you plan to transport pulpwood, sawbolts, or bark used for fuel to assure that they are under the Minnesota Department of Agriculture compliance agreement prior to transporting your regulated material. Blandin, Boise, Minnesota Power, Potlatch Deltic, Sappy, and Savannah Pallets are the only receiving facilities you can deliver to using a limited permit in Minnesota. Businesses with pulpwood and sawbolt receiving compliance agreements accept all the risk and mitigation responsibility that comes with Spongy Moth quarantine regulations. Under specific guidelines, best management practice, and standard operating procedures, the risk of spreading spongy moth is reduced. This high level of responsibility allows you to travel under a limited permit to their sites. It's very important to accurately fill out your limited permit, as the compliance agreement holder is periodically audited by state and federal officials. To recap, pulpwood requires a limited permit leaving the quarantine, going to a receiving mill. Sawbolts also require a limited permit leaving the quarantined area when going to a receiving mill. And bark for fuel going to a receiving mill also requires a limited permit. A limited permit must be filled out accurately and entirely. They expire annually on April 30th. DNR stubs and/or scale tickets are not acceptable. Please expect to receive your limited permit electronically once we have received all necessary items. Again, a limited permit is only used when going to an approved facility. An accurate statement is a travel documentation when you have a compliance agreement with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the receiver also has a compliance agreement. Both the transporter and the receiver must have these agreements to 100% visual inspection is required by both parties. Under accurate statements, you can transport saw logs, firewood, and landscape mulch. Holiday greenery, nursery stock, interstate movement must all be under a compliance agreement. For interstate movement, you need to contact the USDA. Here is an example of an accurate statement that accompanies loads of regulated material out of a quarantine to a specific receiving facility. Again, Both parties have a compliance agreement, and the transporter is using the accurate statement to travel with. Mitigation occurs when both parties take on responsibility that no spongy moth life stages are leaving the quarantine. These trainings are not just about paperwork. It's about the action or actions being taken and where the action is needed in the process. The long-term goal is for all of us to slow the spread, and these protocols will assist with that. Now let's quickly review. In summary, limited permits allow for the movement of pulpwood, sawbolts, and bark used for fuel and can only be received by Blandin, Boise, Minnesota Power, Potlatch Deltic, Sappi, and Savannah pallets. Saw logs, firewood, and landscape mulch all require a compliance agreement and travel under an accurate statement. A limited permit is not valid for the transport of these items. Feel free to grab your phone and take a picture of this slide. It is a great reminder of what you need and for which regulated article requires which documentation. You may also wish to keep your phone out for the next two slides as there is additional contact information. Hopefully that was enough pause so you could quickly snap a picture if needed. You may want to take a picture of this as well. To receive your limited permit from the MDA, this is a 3-step process. Since you made it this far in the training, you have completed one of those steps. You must now submit an application to Gabrielle Reese listed here on the screen and complete a short quiz to test your knowledge. The application and link to the quiz are posted on the website, and you should have received them in an email. You may want to keep your phone out to take one additional picture of contact information. Thank you for taking the time to complete this training and helping slow the spread of the invasive forest pest spongy moth. If you have any questions, please contact Danielle or Gabrielle for further assistance. For questions about interstate travel, please contact Marissa Bendixson at the USDA.